Okay, so Father, Mother, God. Christian Science is considered the only major religion founded by a woman. It was established by Mary Baker Eddy at a time when women could not vote, and it was rare for a woman to be allowed to preach in a house of worship. In 1875, Mary Baker Eddy published the first edition of Science and Health, her textbook explaining the principles of Christian Science, which had come to her through a healing revelation, followed by 2 years of intensive study of the Bible. She follows convention by referring to God as He and humankind in general as man. But there are 9 passages in Science and Health that speak of Father, Mother, God. In fact, we recite the Lord's Prayer at every Christian Science service, since it's the only prayer Jesus recommended in the Bible. And after each line, we repeat Mrs. Eddy's interpretation of that line. So it starts, Our Father, which art in heaven, our Father, Mother, God, all harmonious. There are 2 parts to this talk. First, we'll look at how Christian Science and the early women's rights movement were intertwined. Then we'll discuss how Mary Baker Eddy brought the feminine into our understanding of God and what it means in spiritual practice to see God as Father, Mother. Susan B. Anthony was born in 1820. Mary Baker Eddy was born in 1821. In 1887, in the midst of Anthony's long career of activism on behalf of the suffrage amendment to the US Constitution, she took a 12-day course on Christian Science healing from one of Eddy's students. Anthony later attended a lecture given by Eddy in Chicago, and the Mary Baker Eddy Library in Boston has a letter that Anthony wrote to Eddy, as well as a copy of Science and Health inscribed by Anthony to her longtime companion, Edith Gross. Anthony was a Quaker, and there's no evidence that she joined the Christian Science Church, but she wrote of her respect for the new religion. Suffrage leader Alice Paul was also a Quaker. In 1913, while she was in her 20s, she took charge of the effort to pass the suffrage amendment to the Constitution. One of her methods, which she learned from experience with Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters in Britain, was to protest in the street on behalf of suffrage, get arrested, and go on hunger strike to demand better treatment in prison. The result was being force-fed through a tube inserted down the throat or up the nose, a very painful process that was said to have impaired her health. Alice Paul's sister, Helen, became a Christian Scientist and started a Christian Science church in the village of Moorestown, New Jersey. Helen sometimes served as Alice's secretary and belonged to the National Woman's Party, which Alice had founded. When Alice collapsed during picketing in 1917, she was hospitalized with a diagnosis of Bright's disease, a kidney ailment that was usually fatal. A second opinion determined that she had been misdiagnosed and she was sent home to rest, which was very hard for her to do. On the way to her recovery, Alice received treatment from a Christian Science healer in Philadelphia. When the suffrage amendment was passed in 1920, Alice turned to the next step, trying to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, which she was the author of. Helen, the Christian Scientist's sister, wrote articles in support of the ERA for the Christian Science Monitor, the newspaper founded by Mrs. Eddy. The ERA, as you probably know, still has not been passed. So there are records of Christian scientists working with suffrage groups. And Mrs. Eddy paid $1 in dues to a suffrage organization in 1888, March. She did not participate in political action for suffrage or for other causes. Her mission was to revolutionize consciousness by changing the basis on which people viewed the world, themselves, and each other. Because we're all expressions of God, she asserted the worth of every individual, regardless of age, race, heritage, or gender. She saw equality of the sexes as a God-given truth. Science and Health states, in natural law and in religion, the right of woman to fill the highest measure of enlightened understanding and the highest places in government is inalienable. And actually, we've made a handout. I'm going to be reading a lot of quotes, mostly from Science and Health and other places. But the quotes they're in a handout if you're interested. Yeah. The Mary Baker Eddy Library produces a podcast called Seekers and Scholars. In one episode, researchers point out how Mrs. Eddy's personal experiences related to the passage where she declared, civil law establishes very unfair differences between the rights of the two sexes. Christian Science furnishes no precedent for such injustice, and civilization mitigates it in some measure. Still, it is a marvel why usage should accord women less rights than does either Christian Science or civilization. So to illustrate this point about her personal experiences, let's look at some of the events of her life. Mary Baker grew up on a farm in Bow, New Hampshire. Her parents were devout members of the Congregational Church, and she was deeply familiar with the Bible. And she wrote a little book called Retrospection and Introspection, which has a lot of autobiographical material in it, where she wrote, my father's relentless theology emphasized belief in a final judgment day, in the danger of endless punishment, and in a Jehovah merciless to unbelievers. These were all ideas that Mary rebelled against. However, her mother urged her to lean on God's love, which would give me rest if I went to him in prayer. And Mary gravitated her whole life towards this approach to the divine. In 1843, 22-year-old Mary Baker married Colonel George Glover. She became pregnant and lost her husband to yellow fever barely a year into the marriage. She remarried, but her second husband was unfaithful and refused to live with her son. When the boy was 6 years old, Mary was too ill to care for him, and her father sent the child to live with family friends, who soon moved out west. As a woman, Mary had no legal standing to oppose her father's decision, and she did not see her son again for almost 30 years. In 1866, she fell on the ice and was bedridden with excruciating internal injuries. She was expected to die. She took her Bible and read one of Jesus's healings. A revelation resulted in her getting out of bed, getting dressed, and walking out of the room to the astonishment of friends who had gathered to say goodbye. For the next 2 years, she studied the Bible in great depth, trying to figure out how this healing occurred, and then testing her new understandings by healing other people. In the period when she was learning how to communicate her discoveries, She moved from house to house repeatedly for 10 years. Under the law, married women could not own property separately from their husbands, who had the right to make all decisions about such property. She eventually obtained a divorce from her second husband and was able to buy a house that had rooms she could rent out, providing her with an income and a stable home. These life experiences, no doubt, contributed to the urgency Mrs. Eddy felt when she wrote, "Our laws are not impartial, to say the least, in their discrimination as to the person, property, and parental claims of the two sexes." In 1877, by the way, she married one of her students, Asa Gilbert Eddy. The marriage was harmonious, but sadly, he passed away 5 years later. Given the limitations that society attempted to place on the role of women, Mrs. Eddy's achievements were remarkable. She founded a religion that spread all over the world, started a publishing company, wrote and published Science and Health, established a Pulitzer Prize-winning newspaper that still exists. In 1907, Human Life magazine described her as the most famous, interesting, and powerful woman in America, if not in the world today. She was a role model for the emancipation of women, and her writings on the equality of the genders supported the stance of activists for women's rights. So actually, she didn't start out with the idea that she was going to set up her own church. When she found that her insights could not only heal the sick, but were so systematic, so scientific, that she could teach other people to heal, she thought the ministers of local churches would be excited to incorporate her discoveries into their preaching. But guess what? A Seekers and Scholars episode outlines the opposition she faced when she dared to suggest that Christianity had lost the healing powers demonstrated by Jesus because the theology that underlay his healings had not truly been understood. Her textbook, after several editions, was renamed Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, drawing attention to her interpretations of Bible passages, which roused fierce opposition. Often gender was the focus of criticism. Lutheran minister Alvin E. Bell wrote, "How could anyone who knows what God's word teaches believe the word of any woman?" The Presbyterian Quarterly attacked Science and Health for challenging the literal truth of the Adam and Eve story, which, quote, "makes woman's subjection to man a part of the creative plan and fundamental law of human society." So let's take a look at the chapter of Science and Health that addresses the two stories of creation, because they're important both to the principles of Christian Science and to beliefs about the equality of the sexes. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Mrs. Eddy's commentary states, "The infinite has no beginning." She sees Genesis 1 not as a chronological account. It represents the unfolding of divine principles to human understanding. We begin with the most basic fact of being, that God is the creator of everything. Not that there was once nothing and God created something, but that God is continually creating the universe from the infinite divine source. Already, with the first sentence of the Bible, she's rearranging our view. She goes on to interpret Genesis 1 line by line, explaining the spiritual concepts as they increase in complexity. Light is not sunbeams, but a symbol of understanding. Stars, air, land, water, plants, and animals are not physical entities, but expressions of divine spirit. Repeatedly, the scripture adds, "And behold, it was very good." Mrs. Eddy remarks, "Everything good or worthy, God made. Whatever is valueless or baneful, he did not make. Hence, its unreality." So here she is contradicting the widespread view of God as punishing sin by causing suffering. Instead, she sees God as entirely good and evil as a false belief and illusion. When it comes to people, Genesis 1 says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them." Here Mrs. Eddy writes, "To emphasize this momentous thought, it is repeated that God made man in his own image to reflect the divine spirit." So this is another essential principle, that we are reflections of God, and therefore our true natures are also entirely good. She goes on, "It follows that man is a generic term. Masculine, feminine, and neuter genders are human concepts." When she gets to the end of her analysis of Genesis 1, she describes it as the history of spiritual creation, a narrative of being that is without beginning or end. All that is made is the work of God, and all is good. Then she moves on to Genesis 2 and writes, "Now the opposite error, a material view of creation, is to be set forth. In this erroneous theory, matter is represented as the life-giving principle of the earth. Spirit is represented as entering matter in order to create men." For centuries, religious scholars have been struggling to reconcile the two contradictory versions of creation. Often they focus on the chronology, claiming that the second one is an account that was skipped over in the first version, and they're just going into greater detail. Other analysts suggest that they show different aspects of God, the creator God and the personal. Rather than trying to reconcile the two stories, Mrs. Eddy says flatly that the second one is wrong. She considers Genesis 2 an account of the erroneous negative and material beliefs that we accept as reality, and that Christian Science practice enables us to transcend in our daily lives. Genesis 2 states, "The Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground." That is, man is made of matter, not spirit. Later, woman is made from the body of man. Instead of remaining very good, the two of them get involved with a devious serpent. The first sin is blamed on woman, and God gives man authority over woman, telling her, "Thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over me." This is often cited as proof that men are supposed to dominate women. By rejecting the story of Genesis 2, Mrs. Eddy not only asserts the basic principles of God as entirely good and matter as an illusion, she also rejects the concept of inequality between men and women. It's not surprising that the male theologians of the late 1800s were upset. So, what does it mean to see God as father, mother. There's not too many religions that I know of that do that. I mean, you know, we have a lot of prehistory religions that are based on matriarchies and the woman goddess. But in the modern world, I don't know of any religions that call God father, mother, or mother, father. You can correct me if you don't know. Although Mrs. Eddy states that gender is an artificial construct, these human stereotypes are a big part of our thinking. So she uses them to help us understand God. She writes, "The ideal man corresponds to creation, to intelligence, and to truth. The ideal woman corresponds to life and to love. In divine science, we have not as much authority for considering God masculine as we have for considering him feminine, for love imparts the clearest idea of deity." In a similar vein, Science and Health includes a chapter on marriage, where Mrs. Eddy explains that masculine and feminine qualities complement each other in a relationship. But she concludes, both sexes should be loving, pure, tender, and strong. I suppose women have made progress since the turn of the century, but the Equal Rights Amendment has yet to be passed, and we still struggle against sexism. It's inspiring to practice a religion where equality between the sexes is built in as a fundamental truth. I'd like to close with an example of how God as Father Mother manifested in a healing I experienced. Some of you have heard this before, and I also wrote about it years ago in the Woodstock NY. So if it sounds familiar, that's right. But first of all, I just want to say that Christian Science is very practical. It can heal health issues, emotional states, relationships, financial problems, all kinds of challenges. Some healings are quick or even instantaneous. Others take more time. Usually, we have to sort through our thoughts and discover what we need to learn to bring those thoughts into alignment with divine mind. So here was a particularly lengthy healing that came along not too long after I got involved in Christian Science. I was suffering from pain in my back and my hip. Standing up and sitting down were difficult, and turning over in bed was really hard, although walking, luckily, made me feel better. I tried to heal the pain metaphysically by reminding myself that God, who is all good, was in charge, not the erroneous belief in a malfunctioning bodies. But the condition persisted. I spent a lot of time wondering what had caused the problem, which is irrelevant in Christian Science, since God is the only cause and God is entirely good. Whereas dwelling on possible physical causes only strengthens the delusion that evil and matter have power. I was getting scared that the pain would get worse and I'd end up paralyzed. That's my imagination. So after a month or so, and I wasn't making much progress, I decided to try body work. I went to a chiropractor and then to various massage therapists. Each one kind of rearranged the symptoms, but didn't really resolve them. After 4 months and $1,000, I gave up and decided to buckle down to metaphysical healing. I started by disciplining my thought, halting every impulse to wonder about the cause or worry about consequences. And I used those moments of awareness to turn towards the consciousness of divine good around and within me. One day, the pain grew considerably worse. I called a Christian Science practitioner, which is a professional dedicated to the full-time practice of prayerful healing with others. I told her I was worried I would never feel my connection with God consistently enough to find healing. And I wrote down her reply. You are not a human being making your way to spirit and perfection. You are now, today, the exact reflection of God in every aspect of you, governed directly by divine mind. This pronouncement took my breath away, and her absolute confidence was inspiring. The next day, my back was 90% better, not just better than the day before, but better than it had been from the start of the pain. At first, I was ecstatic. I had a real healing, and doubts crept in. Maybe just resting instead of walking had made it better. No, I had a real healing, and it would deepen my faith in science. There was no proof. It didn't just get better on its own. So all day long, I just had this argument going on in my head, driving me nuts. Finally, I went for a walk, and I pleaded with God for a thought that would help me. We don't generally like ask God to heal us, because that's not God. You know, that's the problem is an illusion, so it is pointless. But you can ask God for insights. And I managed to calm my mind down enough, and I heard these words. Just choose. You can choose hard work, struggle, and worry, or the ease of falling into a feather bed. Along with this thought came a sensation of such tenderness, of being held by that all-embracing feather bed. The battle of thoughts ended. It took another month or two and a few more insights into my crazy thought process for my back pain to be completely healed. But since then, when I find myself mesmerized by what the five senses are telling me, and it's difficult to grasp spiritual truth, I remind myself of that fatherly advice. Just choose. And when I'm stuck in negative thoughts and having trouble opening my heart to divine love, I recall that exquisite motherly tenderness and the softness of the feather bed. Those are my connections to Father and Mother God. Thank you for listening.